Hello, everybody. We are the Ohio chapter of the Horror Writers Association, which is an international organization that promotes spooky literature. And we are here to talk to you about horror publishing. So I will ask a few questions of our lovely panelists, and hopefully we'll have time at the end for some of your questions. So we're going to start with introductions. So we'll start with Sarah, and you can tell us all a little bit about yourself and what you write.
Hi, I'm Sarah Hans, and I write mostly horror, shockingly. I'm also a teacher in Central Ohio.
My name is Lucy Snyder. I write horror and science fiction, which this book is both. I live currently just north of Columbus, and I have, I think, about 20 books out in various genres.
Today I'm Mina Hardy. Mina Hardy writes thrillers and horror. I also write romance and women's fiction and a bunch of other stuff under my real name, which is Megan Hart. And I live in Dayton.
I'm Rob E. Boley. I also live in Dayton with her. I write mostly horror, dark fantasy, a little bit of science fiction and some other stuff, some poetry. That's who I am.
All right, so new authors often ask us, how do you become a published author? So I would like to ask each of you how you began in horror publishing. Like, what was your first published project, and what was the process of getting that out into the world?
Can we start with that,
Sure. So like the whole story? Like
Well, you know, we've got time, but you know.
All right. So I started writing, let's see. All right, so for the longest time, I mostly just wrote poetry, and then after my daughter was born, for whatever reason, that just kind of triggered something in me, so I was like, I want to write stories, I want to write screenplays, novels, so I started mostly with short stories, a few really bad books, and then I was, I don't know how old my daughter would have been, maybe 4 or 5, I'm not sure, but she wanted to watch Snow White, and she became obsessed with Snow White. It was like the first movie she ever saw, and we watched it at least once a week, and at some point while we were watching this movie, near the end, I was like, it'd be a lot cooler if when Snow White woke up, she was a zombie. Because why would you create a curse that's so easily broken? So that kind of that was the spark. I was like, oh, that'd be a really good short story. And I started writing it, and it ended up becoming a book. And then I was like, well, I might make this a trilogy. And now I'm in the middle of I'm just about to come up with the 10th book in that series. It's all it's called The Scary Tales. It's all a bunch of mashups of fairy tales and monsters. And how I got it published is got a scholarship to the Antioch Writers Workshop, and was in the afternoon fiction writing seminar with a noir writer named Les Edgerton. And he and I really, really hit it off, and kind of hung out the whole week. And toward the end of the week, he was like, you're really cool. I like this book you have. I'll mention it to my publisher. And I was like, okay, cool. And nothing came of it. Months and months and months went by. And then I was actually at a conference here in Columbus for my day job, which is fundraising at Wright State. And I got a call from Les's publisher, and he was at a conference, and he just talked to Les about my book, That Risen Snow. And I told him a little bit about it right there on the spot, and next thing you know, I was signing a contract, and then I was a published horror novelist, I guess. So my 2 big takeaways for anybody that's interested in publishing is go to writing events, get to know people, connect with them on a genuine level, not in a weird Uber networking level, but actually connect with people as a human being and develop friendships. And also apply for scholarships, because there's all kinds of grants, awards, scholarships, things out there. I think a lot of people don't apply because they don't think that they would ever have a shot at getting it. I got 2 full scholarships to the Antioch Writers Workshop for completely different contests and different scholarships. And if I can do it, then anybody can do it, because I'm not that amazing. So that's my how I got into horror writing.
Well, back in the olden days when you had to send your paper manuscripts through the mail. I've been writing for a really long time. I've been writing stories basically since I was able to write stories. In elementary school I was writing stories and knew I wanted to be a writer. I started off writing short science fiction and horror and fantasy. Those were my loves. And then in 2002, I sold my first book to, at the time, digital-only publisher, very small. That was before ebooks even, like, you had to get them on a PDF on your browser, like no Kindle, no nothing. But from there, I continued writing, and I wrote and published many, many romance novels, romance and women's fiction, with traditional publishing, small press, digital publishers, and how that happened was just finishing books, trying to get an agent, finally securing an agent, which is, I think it's harder to get an agent than it is to get published. And then the agent sent the books out, and I happened to be writing the thing that the publishers wanted at the time, and so that was lucky for me. And it just went on from there, and I just kept writing and writing, and I always wanted to write horror and science fiction. And so finally, in the past few years, I've been writing and publishing thrillers, dark thrillers, fiction, and horror, and that's under a pen name because, rightly so, the publisher said we don't want your romance readers to think that they're getting a romance when everybody is getting killed or whatever. Although I always like to say that writing horror and writing romance is very similar because there's a lot of screaming and body fluids, depending on how you do it. But, so my path to publication was pretty traditional, even though it did start off in what was at the time ebooks. And I don't know about advice other than explore all of your options and explore all your avenues. There are so many different places now, different ways to publication that just, they didn't used to exist, and now they do. So don't cut yourself off from thinking I'll never be published, or I'll only be published if I can do it this one way. There are so many different ways to get your book published now. So don't discount them. Do your research and figure out what's your best choice. I think that answers your question.
And others, yes.
Okay, so I'll tell the story of my very first short story sale and my first novel sale, because they're connected. Anyway, I started writing when I was like 11 or 12. Like, I kind of wanted to be a writer the moment I started learning how to read, because, you know, just the way that books, especially science fiction, fantasy, and horror books made me feel, I was just like, I wanna do this. This is so cool. So I had been, as you know, a teenager in high school and undergrad, I'd been reading like Asimov science fiction and other magazines, and I'd started writing short stories. And I'd written some short stories but hadn't sent them out any place. And I finally had a short story which was a mix of science fiction and horror that I felt like, okay, this has a shot. And so I sent it out, and the very first magazine I sent it to, they bought it. And I was like, oh, cool, this is easy, I can do this. It took me 7 freaking years to sell another short story. In the intervening time, I went to the Clarion Science Fiction Fantasy Writers Workshop and a bunch of other stuff. You know, got my first master's degree. So I guess the take-home message with that is you can get really lucky, but also you need to be persistent, because you will get a lot of rejections if you go the traditional route, which back when I started, that was the only route to take. Later on, my first novel, which was a dark urban fantasy called Spellbent, came about because I'd been invited to write for a theme anthology that was called Apprentice Fantastic. It was about, urban fantasy apprentices and things like that. Anyway, I'd pitched an idea and I'd gotten started on the story, and then I lost my spot in the anthology because of a miscommunication. But I was like, well, I actually am kind of enjoying the story, so I'm going to keep going with it. And I kept going with it, and it turned into a novel. And when I finished it, I thought, okay, well, I need to find an agent, because You know, I know from the experiences of a lot of my friends and acquaintances that, you know, you really need an agent for a novel. You get a much better deal that way and have access to much better markets that way. So I had found out through the grapevine that there was a literary agency that was reopening after it had to close for a couple of years because the president had gotten sick. Her name was Janet Berliner, and her assistant agent, Robert Fleck, was doing most of the actual work for the agency. So I sent my manuscript into her agency, and within like a couple days, Robert got back to me, and you know, I'd sent a partial and a synopsis, and he asked to see the full, and I had to very quickly finish it because like I hadn't like written the last 2 chapters, and so there was a lot of panicked finishing of the manuscript. And one thing led to another, and he ended up buying it. But his name had seemed really familiar. His name was really familiar, and I went back and looked, and wouldn't you know it, he was the managing editor of that very first magazine that I sold to. Like, and this was like, you know, a gap of many, many years. And in the meantime, he had come up from being like, you know, the managing editor of this little tiny science fiction and horror magazine to working as an agent. So I guess take-home message number 3, besides, you know, people can get lucky, persist. And the third thing is that people move up in the industry and move around in the industry. So, you know, the contacts that you make, you know, back in the day can come around again in some interesting ways. And like, he didn't remember me until I mentioned it, and he was like, oh my God, that's crazy, you know, but it was kind of fun. So those are the first 2.
Well, I, just like everybody else, I started writing when I was really, really young. Before I could write, I told stories to my stuffed animals, but they were very derivative. They were not good stories. And I stopped writing because at 18, I sent off a story to a major magazine, and that was back when you mailed them, and it came back with all sorts of red ink all over it, and I was too young and like precious, and so I was heartbroken. So I stopped writing for a long time, and then I went to a science fiction convention and sat in on a panel where they talked about how you could write short stories and get paid money for it, and I was like, that sounds great. So my goal was to pay for conventions with writing short stories, and I started off just trying to get token payment because I didn't really care about getting professionally, you know, getting paid 5-6 cents a word. So I was just making 1 cent a word. But the first story that I sent out was purchased, and then the second one, and then the third one, right? So I'm grateful that I went for those smaller markets that paid nothing, because I don't think I would have continued if I hadn't had those early successes where I was like, okay, this doesn't completely suck. Like, it's good enough to at least be in an anthology that pays something, even if it's just a small amount. And then over the years, you know, you just like Rob said, you go to conventions and you go to events and you meet people and you make friends with them, and then when they're really drunk, you pitch them projects, and they go, yeah, sure, let's publish that. And yeah, and that's how a couple of my books have been published. Also,
Me too.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
All the business happens in the bar at these
Right,
conventions.
right,
That's
yeah.
where the magic
or,
happens.
Or at a friend's house where they've invited a bunch of horror writers to come hang, and you're all around a bonfire, and everyone's been drinking, and so. And then this one I got published because I went to StokerCon and pitched it to a publisher there, and then to a couple publishers actually, and then when this publisher went out of business, I went to the guy who had published my first collection, and I said, hey, will you republish this, because my publisher's closing and it's only a year old. And so he republished it. And so if you have relationships with people in the industry, then you can do that. You can go to them and say, hey, I need somebody to help me put this book out again. Now I would probably just self-publish it. But he does send me a check every quarter, like $50 every quarter. So, you know, it's not like I'm getting nothing from that publisher. So that's the main thing, honestly, is just building relationships. And for me, it was kind of starting small. Just like Lucy started, in the big leagues, and then couldn't sell another one for 7 years, right? Whereas I was selling stories, I just wasn't making very much money on them. So there are a lot of different ways that you can do it. And when we first started, you know, when I first had my first story published years ago, I, at the time, told people I would never self-publish because I don't want to learn how to format, I don't want to learn how to I don't want to have to deal with the cover art, the ISBNs, all that business. Now I self-publish stuff all the time because Amazon and Canva, and I use a program called Atticus for the formatting because I don't have a Mac. And so like now you can just self-publish anything that you want, and that is kind of amazing. So there are a lot of different avenues now to being published, but because I started, you know, years and years ago, I started with small indie presses, and that's mostly where I've lived. Yeah, so that's my sordid tale of how I started getting published.
Awesome. Well, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Denise Marie Gay, and I write horror comedy, and I'm your moderator for today. So I did the opposite of all of these folks. I'm the newbie. I didn't start until 2019. I had a career as a journalist working for Bloomberg, Newswire, and the Columbus Dispatch, covering business and finance and insurance and financial fraud and very serious things. And now I write comedy because I'm tired of dressing up in a suit and being serious. But in 2019, I was given a terminal cancer diagnosis, and I decided that I was going to write some things to leave behind for my family and my friends that were in my voice. So I decided to write this horror comedy series. And when I was like, well, how am I going to get this out in the world? Like, I should publish this just so it's out there in case I'm dead, which, spoiler alert, I didn't die, so knock on wood. So the traditional route to me was not appealing because I'm like, okay, so if I query, I try to get an agent, and then I try to get a publisher. It could take 2+ years to do each of those things. Like, I could be waiting 2 years for a rejection or to hear back to say yes or no, and I'm like, I literally had an expiration date on me, and I'm like, I do not have 2 years to wait. This needs to happen now. So I was like, okay. So I looked around online, which is a cesspit of misinformation when it comes to self-publishing. Trust me, the sharks are circling. But I did find this Facebook group called 20 Books to 50K. And it's an absolutely amazing research on information on how to self-publish. So I combed that group. I found some authors that I thought were comparable to me. So I did all the things. I basically decided to self-publish, which is not for everybody. It's for me, because you know, you have to basically become a small press. You have to do things like find a cover artist, commission a cover. You have to figure out your book marketing. You have to write all your Amazon blurbs. You have to figure out how to do Amazon metadata and keywords. I mean, there's a very steep learning curve, but the reward potential is very great if you do really well in that space. So I decided to self-publish, and then I hit publish 5 years ago, almost today, and it's been absolutely amazing and successful. And I've been very lucky. So because I self-published, I did not have to wait for rejection. I get to keep 99% of the royalties I make versus a traditional contract where you might be making 8 to 10 to 15%, maybe. I don't know. So it's been financially rewarding. And then self-publishing used to have like a bad reputation, because it was a lot of like people buying pallets of books that then sat in their garage forever, because there didn't used to be a way to actually sell those or promote those books. But now, like, it's much, much easier to promote your book and make it look just as good as a traditionally published novel. So there's a lot of opportunity there. What was my point? Oh, yes, so now self-publishing doesn't have the bad reputation generally that it used to have, and it can create opportunities for you if you do it well. I have become a hybrid author. A hybrid author is now somebody who is both traditionally published and self-published. So my audiobook editions were picked up by a traditional audiobook publisher called Podium Publishing, and they landed an amazing narrator. So basically my self-publishing success created traditional publishing opportunities for me, which I think is a thing that didn't used to happen. So yeah, I'm the opposite track of everybody else, but I feel like now, like, more horror authors are seeing opportunity in the various publishing paths, because there are multiple ways to get your work out there in the world. So there is no one way. So that's me. All right, so let's talk about book marketing. Woohoo! Because one of the differences between traditional and self-publishing, at least historically, is that the expectation was that traditional publishers would do most of the marketing for you, and self-publishing, you're doing most of the marketing for yourself. So some of you are trad, some of you are hybrid. Can we talk about what authors are expected to do now for marketing? Because it has changed. Like if you are with a traditional or small press, what do your publishers do for you, or what they expect you to do, versus say self-publishing when you're expected to do everything? So who would like to start?
I mean, I can start.
All right, do it, Lucy, for the win.
Okay, so right now, in the best case scenario, I think in terms of what an author can expect if they have a book out with a large publisher. My most recent novel is out from Tor Nightfire, and I can confidently say that they have been the best publisher I've ever worked with, and I've worked with a lot of publishers. I've worked with my original urban fantasy trilogy was out from Del Rey, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And comparing my experience with Nightfire versus Del Rey, it's like Nightfire is just way better. Let's see, things that they did, they just put money into this, and I think I just got sort of like the standard package. Like they didn't market me like they would somebody that was already a bestseller or that they expected to become a bestseller. But they bought ad space. They bought display space in bookstores. You know, you see the end caps in bookstores like Barnes and Noble and stuff. That is a paid space. Like you don't get space in those displays most of the time unless your publisher is paid for those. In small indie bookstores, it may be very different. It may just be that these are staff picks out of the goodness of their heart. But most of the time in the big chains, like if you have prominence, it's because the publisher paid for it. They paid for ads in like trade magazines and things like that. They sent specific marketing out to libraries. They paid for me to go on a regional book tour. I mean, like, this is the first time that had ever happened. Like, you know, they made all of the arrangements. Like, they contacted the bookstores, they set up the dates, they paid for my hotel room, they paid for my travel, they paid for my meals. Like, all of that was paid for, which I had never experienced before. And like, it was just tough that if I had been, you know, self-published or published with a much smaller publisher, like I would have had to have done that myself. And, you know, I certainly would have gone out and promoted the book on my own, but I wouldn't have been able to do quite all of what, you know, like I wouldn't have gone to Boston, you know. That's a big deal. Yeah, so I've been treated extremely well by this group. Compare that to Del Rey, where they put a fair bit of marketing into the first book, like in terms of buying ad space and things like that. But then for books 2 and 3, they just kind of like chucked them out into the market, and what happened. And that's kind of what they tend to do, and it's kind of a sink or swim type scenario. And as a consequence, like the first book in the trilogy, the one that they actually put a little bit of marketing effort behind, did really, really well. Like I earned out my advance just on the strength of, I earned out my advance for all 3 books just on the strength of that one book, which is pretty unusual.
Amazingly cheerful. All right.
All right.
Okay. So where was I? Yeah. So even if you get a deal with a very large publisher, they may or may not be willing to put money behind it, but they have access to promotional resources that you as an individual just won't unless you come into this as a millionaire or something. Like if you have a whole bunch of money, like there have been cases of people who were self-publishing successes early on who they just personally had a lot of money to put into it and promote their stuff, and that's how they became successful. But yeah, it's all sort of downhill from there in terms of like I said, the smaller the press is, or if you're doing it yourself, the more you'll have to figure out what to do. And my own personal take on it is that there is so much you could do, it's enough to drive you crazy. So pick things that you vibe with. Pick things that you feel like, okay, I can do this on the daily basis and I'm not gonna hate it. Like if you enjoy social media, do that. You know, if you enjoy, you know, other forms of promotion, do that. So.
Does your publisher have have they talked to you about what they expect you to do? Like, do they talk to you about that, or you just make it up as you go?
It kind of depends on the publisher.
Okay.
I think a lot of publishers, I take it upon myself to learn some promotional stuff most of the time. So working with Raw Dog Screaming Press, which is the press that's put out my most recent short story collections. A side note, if you write short stories, you're probably going to be working with a smaller or mid-sized press. It's very, very difficult to sell a short story collection to a major publisher. They didn't ever have that conversation with me, but it was like I was already out there doing the thing, and I think that they saw that I was doing the thing. So, it would just be a matter of, hey, we're going to have a presence at such and such a convention. Do you think you can be there? It was more like they didn't dictate what I was supposed to do, but it was just sort of more a matter of coordination. And with Nightfire, it was like, hey, how would you feel about going on a book tour? And I would be like, yes, I want to go on a book tour. And then they were like, well, where do you think you would like to go? How would you like to do it? They gave me an option of, we will fly you out places, or if you would rather drive, we can set up something based around that. And I prefer to drive. Not a big fan of flying right now, so. I just did sort of the regional tour, whereas I think if I'd been willing to fly, maybe I would have gone to LA and some other more major cities, and maybe had fewer dates. So.
All right, awesome.
Does that answer your question?
Of course, it's lovely. Anyone else like to talk about book marketing? And what is the expectation of what publishers do for you versus what you do for yourself?
Lucy covered a lot about what you can expect. I mean, even if you're with several traditional publishers, they're going to be very different in what they offer you and how much money they put behind you. One of the main things that I've found about being published traditionally is that they will do the outreach generally for getting blurbs from other authors, which I hate. I don't like to do that. I don't like to ask somebody to read my book and get say a nice thing about it. I would like that the publisher would do that for me instead. They'll also pursue things like paid reviews for Big Kirkus reviews, or get your book reviewed by Publisher Weekly. Obviously not everybody, but that's something that it's more difficult to do that on your own.
I can hold that if you don't want to hold it.
And you have to pay for some of these things. So really what it comes down to is, for me, there'll be opportunities. Hey, would you submit my book to this contest? Would you submit my book to this magazine as a bookshelf? And would you do that for me? So I have done a lot of sort of on the ground, well, where would I like them to do this? And then they do it, but they're not necessarily sending me a list of ways that they have decided to find places to submit my book, but they're always really open to. I'm speaking of Crooked Lane specifically. They're always like, yes, we can get them a copy of the book, or we'll submit, whatever's required if it's a contest, or we'll provide the books if it's a certain event or things like that. So that support is really nice. But as far as independently marketing yourself, yeah, find what you like, put as much money in it as you can or feel comfortable doing. You can explore Facebook and Amazon ads if you want to, but hate that and you don't have a lot of money to put into it. I don't know. Honestly, I wish somebody could tell me how to do it really well, because it changes all the time. And also, word of mouth is probably, in my opinion, the best way to sell books, is by people talking about it and recommending it. And you can't really make that happen. It has to happen organically. How to do it? No idea.
Yeah, so I mean, every publisher I've worked with has been a pretty small press that pretty much, I was doing most of my own marketing. So that's kind of where I've been, and I don't have a whole lot to add to what's already been said, except that I guess I'll share two of the coolest self-marketing things that I did for the sequel to this book, which was also still a Snow White zombie mashup. I had a book launch party at a local brewery. At the time, this was in Dayton, and at the time we had this hugely popular food truck called Zombie Dogs. And this was back when Walking Dead was kind of really, really popping, and student from Wright State dressed as a Snow White zombie, and it was huge. Like, we had lines out the door. I sold all my books. It was awesome. It was a really, really great event, but it was exhausting. It was so much work to organize that and get it all set up and work with everybody. So it was cool, but it was like a one-time thing. I have no interest in ever doing that again. It was too much. I'm not that much of a extrovert, so it was exhausting on multiple levels. Other cool thing is a fellow creator in Dayton, Amy Kohler Anderson. She's a great artist, and we had always talked about partnering on something. We talked about doing a comic book, but that really didn't she didn't want to just draw the same thing over and over, sequentially in panels. So we settled on doing an adult coloring book, and we did a Kickstarter for it, which again was a lot of work. We filmed, the trailer for it. She did all the art. I wrote the story. We marketed the hell out of it. We also had a big launch for it at a different brewery in Dayton, because anytime you can involve beer, that's good. In your marketing, I'm just gonna put that out there. Or
Seems to be a
booze.
theme.
But it was a really cool experience. Very, very successful. So successful that I've actually got boxes of these coloring books, so I'm giving them away today. So if anybody wants an adult coloring book that's a mashup of Pied Piper and Gremlins, please stop by the table and grab one. I'll happily sign it for you.
I totally need that.
So it was a cool bit of marketing. It got both of our names out there, maybe kind of cross-pollinating a little bit, some for art people, my horror fan people. But again, a lot of work. Doing a Kickstarter is basically having a full-time job for 2 months. So all cool things to do, but I think that speaks to what somebody said earlier about do what you love, do what energizes you. Because outreach can also be very, very exhausting, for sure.
I had a thing to add.
Yep.
Just to jump off of what Rob said, if you're looking at the whole marketing thing, thinking, oh God, I don't want to do any of that, fear not. There are people out there who are professionals, who are book marketing professionals, like Beverly Banbury is one of them. You want to network and find out who the good people are. But if you really kind of want to be hands off as much as possible, because you think social media is gross and you think that advertising in general is gross and you just can't bring yourself to feel enthusiastic about it, other people will take that hit for you, but it'll cost them money.
One more thing to add: if you can possibly marry someone who's really good at doing graphics and marketing and book covers, go for it. That's a really, really good strategy.
Will you marry us too, Meg? Will you marry us? Is there room?
As far as marketing goes, I'm not great at it. That's why most of my horror is published through publishers, because it's another thing that I just don't want to do. I do a lot of in-person events. I try to make a lot of friends, and that has really worked for me. Social media works pretty well for me, but I'm not someone who can update social media super regularly. So if I were to do this full time, I would definitely have to hire an assistant who could do some of those things, take some of that off of my back, because I'm just not super great at it. It's just, I'd rather be writing. I'd rather spend that time writing. So, and if you're self-publishing, then you do a lot of social media, because a lot of it is word of mouth, and then you also do a lot of buying ads through Amazon or Facebook. Different people have success with different platforms, but, and I haven't done any of that yet, because again, I'm not doing it full time. I don't need to make $1 million at it yet. Yeah, I just don't worry about marketing too much. And if you have a publisher, then one nice thing is that there are often people who will buy almost anything that publisher puts out. So you have an automatic audience kind of built in. Even if it's a small press, there will be people who are just a big fan of that small press. And then one of the reasons that I like my publisher, Dragon's Roost Press, so much is because he actually goes to conventions and sells books, and then gives us royalties from the book sales at conventions, which not every publisher does. And that's another way that my books are getting out there, is because he actually goes out in person as well. He'll be here for the Merry Krampus later on in December. So yeah, so there are a lot of different ways to market yourself. And for me, people talk about like your author brand, and I just don't believe in that. I'm just myself. It's too much pressure to like have a fake self that you're like, this is my author brand. Like, whatever. I'm just me. I write things. Please read them.
Well, that's your brand.
That's my brand.
That's your brand. I'm me, I write things. That's your tagline.
I showed up.
All right. Well, in my experience, when authors hear the word marketing, they just like get like, because it sounds gross, and it sounds like, but really marketing is just, you have this book and this emotional experience in this book, and you're just trying to tell the people who are into that kind of book about your stuff. I mean, that's really what marketing is. It's like finding the people that like the stuff that you do and telling them about it. So I feel like if you think of it like that, it's not so icky. I mean, and plus if you are ethical and authentic and not pretending to be somebody else online, then it's easier. But as the self-published person, I have to do all of these things for myself. So I started out very simply. I'm very, very cheap. So I have a tiny budget, but I run Amazon ads, and I try to keep them to 10% or less of my royalties every month, which has worked out well. I also rely heavily on my email newsletter. My goal is to, when people read my book, if they like that and they want more of that, I'm like, how am I going to keep in contact with them, and what are they going to find when they step into my universe after they've finished a book and hit the end? It's like, I want them to hit the end because they will go look for you online. So what are they going to find? So I have like a website, I have a silly YouTube channel, I have a fan group where they get to talk to each other about aspects of fandom for horror comedy, which is my genre. So I feel like I've created this welcoming environment, and that's the strongest part of my marketing. It isn't the ads, it's just being who I am and sharing my love of horror comedy and creating a space for them that's a happy place on the internet where they can do that as well. So that's my method of marketing. I mean, it all technically is marketing, but it's all something that they enjoy being part of. If you're doing it correctly, they're having fun there in your space. They're feeling an emotional connection with your other readers and with you. And it's all just using social media platforms like Facebook groups and, your silly videos on TikTok and Instagram. Like, are they having a good time? And if they are, they will tell people about you. They will share. They will become people who instant buy your books. So marketing doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to feel dirty or salesy or like a car salesman, like trying to push a junker on people. It can be, fun for everybody, including the people that you're marketing to. So that's my marketing. So does anyone else have anyone to add on this? Any other things? Okay. All right, so we've touched a little bit on horror short stories. Horror is unique, in my opinion, in that short stories are still a thing, and there's still actually a paid market for short stories. Like, not a lot of other genres have that. So can you all tell us a little bit about the opportunities that are out there in short stories for maybe new writers? Like, do you write shorts? How have you published them? What are the opportunities in that space? And do you think that that's a good entry point for newbies? Who would like to start?
I'll start since I kind of started with short stories.
All right.
So I started with short stories, and I really struggled to write novels, and I didn't know why. And then I found out that I have ADHD, so there you go. And once I knew that, and I could kind of work with that, and I got medicated, then suddenly novels started to happen. Also, I think I had to get used to novels. My advice to people is if you want to write novels, like if you are a person who naturally writes long form, congratulations, do that. Because writing short stories, unless you are an incredible writer like Ken Liu, who basically made his writing career out of writing award-winning short stories and now publishes fantasy novels, good luck and having anyone notice you or care about you or invite you to a convention or anything for short stories. Like, no one will care. And short story collections are very hard to sell both to publishers and to people. Like, people want to buy novels, right? So it's very hard to have people take you seriously if you're only writing short stories. It does happen, and if you're like me and short story is your natural writing form and you love it and you're going to do it anyway, like you can't help writing short stories, then do that and try to make some money. Like, but if you can spit out a novel, like if novels are your thing, do novels. Short stories really will not get you as far as novels will. Now, that said, I started with short stories, but it has taken me a very long time to get to the point where I am, and I think that if I had started with novels, it would have gone better for me. It would have gone much faster. My career would have built much more quickly.
I agree with everything Sarah just said, but I do want to make a couple of comments about the value of short stories. I feel like I learned a whole lot about the craft of writing in general by writing short stories. I think I developed a much bigger and better tool chest than if I just started trying to write long form. I think I was able to network a lot more effectively and learn a lot more about the people in the industry and the industry itself. I had a lot of opportunities to kind of learn and develop and grow in a not so public way. Like, I had a lot of stories out in smaller magazines that I would get feedback on, but it wasn't like a billion people read my first embarrassing efforts, so I kind of like got to be from like a little writer to a bigger writer, and by the time I felt like I was in a place to write a novel. I did write a novel, and it got picked up by a major publisher, which is a pretty good outcome. And the other thing is that you get to experiment in short stories in a way that you really kind of don't in a novel. Like if you just have a crazy idea you want to noodle around with, you can do that in 3,000 or 4,000 words rather than working on it for months and months and months, writing this 80,000 word novel that you're not sure about the concept of. Like, that's a big investment of time and energy versus if you just want to write a short story. And this actually emerged from a short story. It emerged from two different short stories. The original short story was called Magdala Amygdala, and it ended up winning a Bram Stoker Award, and I got so much like positive feedback on that story. People were like, are you going to expand that into a novel? And after a certain period I was like, well, yeah, obviously I should, so because people keep asking me to. So I think there's a definite value in writing short fiction, but honestly, if you start getting into it, I encourage everybody to try it. But if it's driving you crazy, like you're just like, I can't with this, then don't worry about it. I encourage everybody to try something that's hard, because that helps you grow as a writer. That helps you develop your skills. If you push yourself to try things that are new, maybe a little uncomfortable, a little bit different, but ultimately, don't do something that makes you miserable. If your heart is set on doing a particular thing, don't feel bad about doing that. You get to lean into your strengths as well. But it's important to know what those strengths are, so try lots of different things.
I would say a good resource for those that are interested in short stories and finding a place, finding markets for them is there's a website called horrortree.com, and you can sign up for like a weekly newsletter from them, and I think they publish opportunities and different writing advice throughout the week, but then on Fridays they send out like, here's what came out this week. And it's a great resource, and just about every week there's everything from like pro-paying markets to more like token payment markets to also some that are just they don't really pay anything, but it's a good place to good way to keep your finger on the pulse of what the opportunities are out there. And yeah, if you have, I think if you want to write short stories, it's an awesome thing. It can also lead to really good things. One of the novels I have published was through a publisher that I had no relationship with, other than the publisher had read a short story that was in some market, and he really liked my story, and then he saw my name in the slush pile. I was like, oh, I'm going to take a closer look at that. And it wasn't, I don't even think it was like a pro-paying, like it wasn't a particularly like amazing, short story sale or anything. It was just a random story in a random anthology, and it, for whatever reason, it caught his eye, and he really liked it. So sometimes that short story can lead to bigger things. So I would encourage you, if that's something that you want to do, then go for it.
I love writing short stories. I wish I wrote more of them. I generally write novels, and I used to write really long novels that are getting shorter and shorter. I second take a look at it. One thing about short stories that I find useful is if you look at the open calls, maybe you don't have a story that fits that call already, but maybe you're going to write one now. The downside to that is then you have a story that you wrote for an open call that might be very specific that you can't really sell somewhere else. So that's the downside to writing short stories, kind of to something that somebody else is like, hey, I want this story about, you know, I don't know, pumpkin napkins or something like that. And, you know, then you write a story about pumpkin napkins and like, you know, where else are you going to sell that? But I want to echo what Lucy said. Look, writing sucks enough. Don't do what you don't like. If you don't enjoy what you're doing, there's so many other things you have to do in life that you don't like. Why would you do it with writing? So I always said, one time I was giving a talk to a group of writers, and I said, like, if you can quit, probably go ahead and quit. They got so mad. Oh my God. But I was just like, but like, really, if you can, then why are you torturing yourself? You know, like, the thing about writing is if you can't quit, if you're going to write, whether you're hating it or loving it or, you know, whatever it is, to me, that's what drives the writing. I don't want to quit. I want to keep doing it. So don't torture yourself by doing things that you don't like to do. That's my bit of writing.
Yeah, right. You also, you won't be able to make a living off of writing short stories, but you can make a nice little side income. And you know, there are lots of different payment structures for short stories. So we call token payment is anything that's like just a few cents a word. And then there's professional payment, which I think is up to like, I don't know, 8 or 10 cents a word.
I think so, yeah.
And when I first started out, I sold a lot of stories for very little, and then gradually I was making more and more, and then I finally made my first pro sale, and then suddenly I was being invited to anthologies, and so now when I write a story, I might send it to a few places. I mean, I have stories that have been rejected 12, 15 times, and then I just go, well, I really like this story, but clearly no one wants to publish it, so I'll just hang on to it. And then I'll get an invitation to an anthology, and I'll be like, well, I have this story I wrote 5 years ago that I really believe in. Here you go. And then I'm getting paid for this thing that I wrote a long time ago that I really love, but was never able to sell. So don't ever give up on a short story. If you wrote it and you love it and you believe in it, you will eventually find a place to publish it. And one of my friends that publishes mostly fantasy, she started self-publishing her short stories. If you've got a story that's about 5,000 words, you can stretch it. You can make the formatting, you can put like double the space in between the lines. You can make it big enough that it can be published, self-published on Amazon. So I did that with one of mine, and I'll let you know how successful that is, because she sells them for like, so they're these little tiny skinny books, and she sells them for like $6 a piece at conventions. So I'm gonna try that with one of mine, and I'll let you know how it goes. But yeah, nowadays I don't even, like, what I first started doing was writing for specific calls, and I would try to make my short story as different as I possibly could. So like, because at the time I was like, my writing's probably not that great, I just started this, but I can give you the weirdest take on this topic that you're gonna get. So one of the stories that I sold was it was for a zombie romance anthology, okay? And so I wrote a story about lesbian zombies because I figured they wouldn't get any queer stories. And I made them voodoo zombies instead of like Romero-style zombies, and I thought they're probably also not gonna get any voodoo zombies, right? And so that story sold. So like sometimes you just have to think outside the box and like really come up with the most creative way of exploring that theme. And then even if your writing is not like top tier, you might still get into the anthology because the editor is like, oh my God, I need lesbian voodoo zombies in my anthology, right? So so that's my short story writing advice, I guess.
Okay. Jumping off of what Sarah said, yeah, definitely don't lose faith in a story just because it's been rejected 12 times. Those are rookie numbers. Honestly, if you are not known and you're not being invited to write for anthologies. I mean, getting to the place where, you know, editors know your name and they're sending you invitations to anthologies, like that's the sweet spot right there. Because the expectation is that they're not going to reject you out of hand if you don't deliver a story that they feel like they can use. They'll either give you feedback on rewriting that story, or they'll give you another shot at it with something different. Like that's the expectation there, and you don't get anything like that if you're just submitting cold to an open call. Like the editor may or may not know who you are. They may have blind submissions. You may or may not get feedback. You certainly won't get another shot at it generally. So yeah, if you get to a point where you're being invited, that's really nice. But if you are, you know, branching out into, like, say, a subgenre that where you're not known, don't worry if a story doesn't sell right away, because particularly if you're selling a collection to a mid-size or larger publisher, they're going to want X amount of unpublished work. Like my agent was talking to me about pitching a short story collection to Nightfire because, you know, I'm known for my short fiction more than anything else. But they want 50% new. Well, I don't have 50% new. I don't have like 6 stories that are just, you know, waiting around. My method has been write a short story, sell it, write a short story, sell it. And because I also have ADHD, like the thought of just writing a story and sitting on it just seems, it's hard. It's hard. I want to do something with it. I want to send it out. So, like, I haven't been able to work up a short story collection manuscript for them because of that reason. But, you know, 2 things can happen if you hang on to a short story. One is you save it for a collection later on, or you get invited to submit, or you see new call for submissions where you can either send it out as is or make some adjustments, or you have set it aside for a couple of years and you come back to it and you're like, oh, I know why this is broken, I can fix it now. You know, that happens too. So, yeah, just keep working, keep producing new stuff.
All right, awesome. We're down to our last couple of questions before we open it up to you all. Let's talk about our absolute fails. Tell us about your fails and your rejections, and was there ever a time when you wanted to quit? And if so, what did you do to get past it and keep going? Anyone?
Okay. So when I first started submitting, and I had to mail my manuscript out to a magazine with a self-addressed stamped envelope for its return. Because like, what were you gonna do with the manuscript when it came back? I don't know. Send it out again, all crumpled up. I don't know why we had to do that, but anyway, got a rejection, and the editor wrote on it, "You wasted my time."
Oh.
Wow.
That's brutal.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Rude.
Yeah. I don't remember the name of the editor, but I surely remember how that felt. Obviously, I did not give up, though. Rejection always is hard, no matter where you are in the process. I've published like 100 or so novels, novellas, short stories. Like if you add up everything that I've ever had published, it's a lot. And that's, you know, only the stuff that got accepted. My list of rejections in comparison is vaster, and sometimes when you get that rejection, you can take something from it and say, oh yeah, okay, everyone is saying the same thing, maybe I need to work on this. Or it's just like, oh, you're wrong, my words are precious gold and you don't know what you're talking about. So just depends on the day, but I would say the absolute fail was the wasted my time.
That's how I'm going to sign every email from you to you from now on.
You wasted
You wasted my time, Megan.
I mean, I don't have any rejections that bad. That's like it's usually they're just like, yeah, I don't have any like heartbreaking tales of rejection. I've certainly had plenty of stuff rejected, but nothing super terrible. I've never really wanted to quit because I really enjoy writing. I mean, even if I didn't publish it, I would still like I pretty much write every day, and I'm gonna write every day, so nothing's ever really like stopped me from that. I will say a thing I really particularly despise is when you submit to, especially like a big open call, and then they tell you that you've made the whatever, like the final cut or the first cut, and then you get rejected. Like I hate that. Like I would rather just get straight up rejected than like having that glimmer of hope, and then like you wait a few weeks and then like nah, we pass. Like to me that's just like I would rather just no.
Anyone else?
All right, so here's my greatest shame, okay?
Aw.
So I've obviously received hundreds, maybe thousands of rejections, and that doesn't really bother me, that's fine. Because once you've been the editor, because one of the first things I did was several anthologies, and so once you've been the editor, you understand that, like, it's not personal. And if the editor does actually say in the rejection, like, we really liked this, it just didn't fit, please send us more next time or we do another anthology, they really mean that. Because they don't have time to send that to everyone. So the rejections for short stories don't really bother me anymore. But I've had a couple of occasions to pitch novels to big presses and mid-sized presses. But I didn't have anything finished. Because finishing things is hard when you have ADHD. So I went ahead and pitched a project that was mostly done, and they said, yeah, I definitely want to see that. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna go home and finish it. And then what I've learned is I cannot. As soon as someone is expecting something from me, that PDA, that ADHD, like, well, now I'm not gonna do it. Like, that kicks right in. So now I know I have to finish a project before I show it to anyone, before I pitch it to anyone, but because I'll just fail to finish it. So I have a couple of, like, really good projects that I need to finish, but because I pitched them when they weren't done, I haven't been able to finish them. So maybe someday. But that's just one of those things that you learn about yourself as you go. But that's, like, my greatest failure, I feel like, is that I had the opportunity to send something to an editor at one of the big 5 publishers, and I couldn't finish the book, which is, like, so sad.
It's never too late. Never too late to finish.
I'm not
10
going to
years
talk about my
later.
biggest failure because I'm not that confident. But anyway, I'm going to address what happened.
It's the huggy
What
horror.
happened to Megan. So, like, if you get out there and start submitting over a long enough timeline, you are going to get a really terrible, awful, no good rejection like the one she got. You will get something that will just infuriate you or break your heart. The first thing, I want you to keep 2 things in mind. First is don't respond to them. Like, don't give them a piece of your mind. Just read the email, and if it has anything useful in it, save it or delete it. But generally, if they give you a response like, you have wasted my time, that is an unprofessional response. That person is not a good editor. Maybe they were a good editor at some point. Maybe they'll be a good editor in a year whenever they get their head out of their butt. But that's not a good editor. That's somebody who's angry, who's on a power trip. They're not editing for good reasons. And you will run into people who have become editors because they enjoy the frisson of having power over other people. They enjoy being able to reject people. They enjoy messing with people. This is not the majority of people who are editors, thank God, but they are out there. There are editors who enjoy being professional trolls, and I could name a few names, but I'm not gonna. If you want to find out later, I'll tell you.
I can bleep those out. No.
But, if you get a rejection like this, do not take it to heart, or try not to take it to heart, because this is a person who's trying to mess with you, and they're no arbiter of your worth as a writer or a person or anything else. They're, it's like some jerk on the internet. Well, this is some jerk at the end of an email.
Right.
Try to,
It was
chin
a
up.
physical letter I had to hold in my hand.
Oh my
And I got it,
God.
and I opened it, and I was excited because it was a return letter, and then I saw.
And you're like,
That
I'm never
sucks.
sending a self-addressed stamped
Yeah.
envelope again.
You have to pay 25 cents to get that back.
I paid $3.70.
But yeah.
Wasted your
Yeah,
stamp.
honestly, just try not to take it to heart, because it'll happen sooner or later, and it's terrible, but, don't be crushed by this. Just try to take a deep breath and go on.
I've also had editors who were like, this story is great and I want to include it in the anthology, but I need you to, like, change the whole story. I need you to just make this whole part right here completely different. This whole, like, 5 pages, right? And at the time I was a baby writer, and so I was like, okay, because I didn't know. But that is also very unprofessional. That is not, like, when an editor buys a story, they're buying a story that should be, they like it because it's of what it is. And their edits should be pretty minor. They shouldn't be rewrite the whole story, right? So if they want you to rewrite the whole story, they should just reject it. Although you do occasionally get places that will ask for rewrites before they accept, but it's not like that extensive usually. And so, you know, you don't have to put up with that. You can, and at the time I wasn't even getting paid very much for that story. So now looking back, I'm like, why didn't I just tell him to like, F off? Like, why wasn't I just like, well, never mind that. I'm not doing that. Like, if you don't like my story to the point where you want me to completely rewrite it, then why are you including it? But again, it's that power trip, right? That dude made me cry. And I found out later from other authors, especially female authors who worked with him, that he made them cry also. So I think that was his little power trip, was that he was gonna make all the ladies cry. So yeah, so now I have much more of a backbone and would tell that guy off. But back then, I just didn't know.
These stories are kind of worse than I anticipated when I wrote the question, so hugs. This is gonna be a hug it out horror
Right.
panel. All right, last one, and this is simple before we ask, let you guys ask some questions, but we've already touched a little bit on this, but what resources do you recommend for new writers for, say, craft or reputable publishing information? I think Rob suggested Horror Tree for short story calls. Would anyone like to suggest any resources
I mean, in terms of,
for craft or publishing information that's reputable and not scammy?
in terms of craft, Stephen King's book on writing is there's a lot of great advice in that book. I know it gets tossed around a lot, but that's a really good resource. Les Edgerton has a book, had a book, he passed away, called Hooked, which takes a really cool approach to like writing a book, and it really focuses on like what's in the first chapter of the book, and like if you really like lock in that first chapter, it sets up the rest of the book to be a success. So I would really recommend it. I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but I'm sure you can still find it like on Amazon. But Hooked by Les Edgerton is really good. Lucy has what's your book on writing? I can't remember what it's called.
It's called Shooting Yourself in the Head for Fun and Profit.
Yes.
But it's not in print right
It's
now,
not.
so
Is
I
it-
needed
can
to
you-
update it, and I haven't.
Can you find like
There are
is it-
used copies out there, yeah.
Cool. That's a really good book. You have a really good bit in there about kind of like you break down like the bare bones of a short story, what makes a short story successful, and what makes it work. And it really, I remember when I read that, like I really clicked something, and it's oh yeah, that's really great advice. So if you can dig that one up, get that one. That's a good book.
Shooting Yourself in the Head for Fun and Profit.
Which, thanks Rob for mentioning it, because then she didn't have to feel bad mentioning her own book. So, well done, yeah.
I am a big fan of buying books about how to write well and then never reading them. I have read Shooting Yourself in the Head for Fun and Profit, and it is great. It's very helpful. I also really liked Nick Momatas's book Starve Better, which is about being a professional writer and some of the like crazy things that he did in order to be a professional writer. Mostly I've taken classes, I've taken a lot of workshops. Lucy put on a workshop that like changed my life. This book was like a result, a
Well,
direct result
Lucy, you're
of
the
Lucy's
star of this.
workshop. And then also it was I started the book because of an exercise we did in Lucy's workshop, and then I finished it because of a workshop that I took from Brad Bollier, and he was using material he'd gotten from Donald J. Moss's book about writing a bestseller. So even though I haven't read Donald J. Moss's book about writing a bestseller, I recommend that one because it goes through the nitty-gritty of like what should be included in each chapter and how to write a chapter so that it propels the audience through the book and creates a lot of tension. And that's useful for any genre that you're writing in. And it also, that method created enough tension that it also propelled me through the book, and I was finally able to finish a novel because I was using his method. So for me, it's a lot of like in-person or online workshops. Lit Reactor used to have a lot of great online workshops, but they closed. I think they're reopened, but I don't know. So you can check out Lit Reactor, and then there are other places, and there are people like Richard Thomas. I have taken a couple of classes with him. They're very expensive, but they're worth it if you can scrape together the pennies, and he does payment plans also. So I've taken classes from him on writing short stories. And then I would also, like, especially if you want to write short stories, I would read the best of anthologies that come out every year. There's Ellen Datlow puts out one every year, and personally, I think that Ellen Datlow's preferences for short stories are very narrow. She has kind of she prefers like a very sort of Western, like her ideal writer, I feel like, is an old British man. And so the stories often feel like they're written by old British men, even when they're not. And they're usually fantastic, but she has certain preferences. So don't just read Ellen Datlow's. Also read other, books of best of. And then, like, there are a ton of really great, indie books out there. But I read mostly like books that you can find at the library that are from major publishers, because that's where I eventually want to be, right? So I read those. I just reread The Exorcist because I really wanted to like break it down and analyze why The Exorcist is so good,
I just reread that
right?
too.
Yeah. So you can do a lot of the work on your own. Looking at bestsellers and books that are now classics and just asking yourself, like, why is this so good? Why is it such a classic? What are the, and really breaking down those elements for yourself. And yeah, it can be expensive, but you can also, there are events like this, and then going to conventions and other opportunities that are less expensive, where you can both network and go to workshops and panels and learn a lot of stuff from that.
Anyone else? Resources? My favorite resources for craft, anything by Lisa Cron, C-R-O-N. I think her book title is Story Genius.
Okay.
And it's about, the biology of, and, story and what it does in our brain, and it's been super helpful to me.
Cool.
John Truby, he's actually a screenwriter, but he wrote some things for writers, like The Anatomy of Story. I thought that was a really helpful resource. As far as marketing, I'm part of a Facebook group called 20 Books to 50K, which is very big, and they used to have a convention in Las Vegas, but it's an overwhelmingly large group, but using the search tab in that is very, very helpful. Like, basically any problem I'm having in my career, I can do a search and I can find people that have been in that situation and get really good advice. And I would also say writer beware, because as soon as you are an artist with a dream, or a writer with a book or a story, the sharks will begin circling, and there's scammers everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be very careful, because many, many smart people I know have nearly or fallen prey to obvious scams just because they didn't. Publishing is this fortress, and people feel like they will do anything to get an in, and that creates opportunity for bad players. So, all right, those are all of our questions. We would like to open it up to see if you have any questions for us. Anyone? Yes?
Yeah, I'd love to know about the pitching process, both online and in person.
Okay. Who you've pitched at StokerCon? Do you want to talk about that, and then anyone else?
Anybody else want to talk about pitching?
I can talk about it a little bit.
All right.
We'll talk a little
You can
bit
go
about
first.
Well, if you're not pitching to someone that has a lot of drinks in them that you're already friends with, then you can sign up for pitch sessions at conventions, and then you want to distill your book down into like what we call an elevator pitch. So it's like the most essential part of your story, and to me, you need to put out there the most interesting part, right? Because if you don't put out, you want to catch their interest, right? So you want to put out the best possible pitch that's the most exciting part of the story. And you usually want to compare it to a couple of other books. So like one of my books that I haven't finished because I pitched it too early, I pitched it as cosmic horror with Anne of Green Gables. Like cosmic horror meets Anne of Green Gables. So they're usually looking for like two things that they can latch onto that are familiar. And if you can make them recent titles, that's really good. So yeah, I guess that's my recommendation, is to try to, give them interesting comps, especially if they're like bestsellers or, something that's really hot right now. And then to like kind of talk about the story and give them the best parts, try to make it sound the most interesting that you can.
I agree with her comment about the comps, like, be thinking about that. And sometimes what works as a comp is not what you will think of, which is why it's helpful to have, other people reading your stuff, that type of thing. But it's also going to depend on who are you pitching to. Because for some people in the industry, the whole idea of the comps and the X meets X thing is distasteful. Like, they really don't like that. They don't react well to that. So, it helps to know who are you pitching to, what is their language, what kind of thing is going to connect with them as a person, as an editor, as an agent, etc. The times that I've pitched, it's actually been pretty low key. I've been talking to an editor, and like for several of my short story collections, I sold them short story collections when they were not open to submissions and hadn't been for a while. But I was just like, hey, I've got a collection of short stories. I know that you liked this thing that I wrote over here. Would you like to take a look at that? And generally, they will say, if you've been having a good conversation, they'll say, yeah, sure, send it along. And then you just, like, the moment you can, send it along, and then you've got your foot in the door and you've got a conversation going. So it helps to have some depth perception. It helps to, again, know who you're talking to, because some people will respond well to the hard pitch because that's what they're expecting, and some people really, really won't. Another time where I pitched a short story, and not like topically, but just like getting an invite to write for an anthology. This was when I was at Gen Con, and Carrie Hughes was co-editing an anthology, a big press anthology of urban fantasy short stories. She was co-editing it with Jim Butcher, which is kind of a big deal. And I overheard her talking about it, and at that point I had my urban fantasy trilogy had come out and stuff. And so I approached her at the bar and said, hey, I couldn't help it over here that you were putting this together. Could I possibly, submit something for this? And she just kind of looks me up and down and says, when were you on a bestseller list? And and I'm like, well, since I'm a short story specialist, I've never been on a bestseller list, but if you're looking for good short stories, I would be the person to be in your anthology. It was like the most ballsy thing I've ever done in my life, like ever.
I think I remember that.
But it totally worked.
I think I was there for that.
Yeah.
And she said something like, well, because you were like, well, I have this trilogy from Del Rey, and she's like, well, did you earn out your advance? And Lucy was like, yeah, I earned out the advance on the first book, and she was like, okay. And it was pretty, and I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
That's how it's done, people.
You may have a part, but
It was incredible.
This was not something I would have, done years before, but like
Right.
I gotten a little bit of confidence. But and that ended up being a really great sale. Like, I not only got money up front, I got royalties, and because this particular anthology ended up on the bestseller list, like I've gotten a steady stream. I've made so much money off that one short story.
Wow.
It's really ridiculous. So
Can I add
yeah.
to that? So, inspired by Lucy's baller move, I wrote a novella like 2 years ago. I don't know. I can crank out a novella pretty fast because, again, ADHD. And at the time, novellas were really hot. I don't know if they still are, because right now it's October and I'm living in kindergarten land.
Yeah.
So novellas were really hot, and so I cranked out this novella, and then there was this publisher that I had really want to work for who almost published this, but they told me to go to the other publisher because they were able to publish it faster. And so I just emailed the publisher and I said, hey, I wrote a novella and I was curious if you wanted to look at it. No big deal if you don't. And she replied and said, well, we were thinking about putting together a novella line, so yeah, send it over. And then a year later it was published. And that all happened because I met this publisher at a random writing retreat, and then got the courage from seeing Lucy do it. So so once you know people, even if they're their gates are not open, they're not accepting proposals, you can still hit them up, and they won't be offended as long as you're not like a jerk about it.
Yeah, it's like once you know somebody a little bit, it's a very different deal than if you're just approaching somebody cold, which is why the whole networking thing on a not a real high pressure, being in people's faces kind of way, because you want to come off as somebody who's chilled and easy to work with, and professional, and somebody who will deliver something that they can use, because this is both a love and a business for most of them. You know, they want to know that you're kind of on the same vibe as they are, but also that you're not going to be a problem, you know?
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of people who will not behave well, and they don't know if any given like cold submission they get is going to be somebody who's going to stalk them or fill
Yeah.
their inbox with profane messages if they reject them.
That's a real thing.
It's a real thing. It's a real thing. So yeah, that's part of why getting to know people is important. Is like at this point I can call Ellen Datlow Ellen. I don't have to
Yeah.
call her Ms. Datlow. It's you know it's kind of cool, but like she knows me. You
Yeah.
know, it's no guarantee that she's going to buy my stuff or anything. She has no
Right.
compunctions about rejecting me, but she's not going to be mad if I call her by her first name. So.
Yeah.
All right, is that it? Any other questions?
Yeah, talk about short stories and versus novels. What's the length difference? I mean, short story like 5,000 words.
Oh, that's a good question. So
I know.
It's a
Do you
little
wanna-
squishy,
Yeah,
but we'll let
yeah,
Lucy do this.
It's a little squishy. So novels generally are considered to start at 60,000 words. This one is 50,000 words. I don't recommend writing anything under 60,000 because very few publishers will actually even accept a manuscript to even look at if it's under 60,000 words. And there are different expectations for novel lengths too, like horror. Generally, unless you're Stephen King or one of his children, is generally the expectation is that it'll be a little bit shorter. It'll be, between 60 and 80. If it's fantasy, it can be 100K. It can be 100,000 words. And then novellas, different places have different definitions for novellas, but like between 20 and 40. And there's like a no man's land between 40 and 60K where you just like either add more or cut some because no one will look at it. And then short stories, 5,000, they'll often say 5,000 is the limit. A lot of places say the sweet spot is between 2,000 and 4,000 words.
Yeah, I feel like
That's
I've
been my
I feel
experience.
like I've been seeing that a lot more lately, like that 2,000 to 4,000.
Right?
A lot of open calls lately have had that, which something I've noticed. Like,
You wanna add?
then there's also flash, like around 1,000
Oh, yeah,
words.
that's
You've got
true.
your flash fiction, which is actually really, really fun to write. Like
It
if you
is,
can
it is.
distill a story down to 1,000 words, like that's a cool challenge.
Yeah, there's the definitions are a little wibbly wobbly. For award purposes, anything 40,000 words and over is considered a novel. But whether you can sell it at that length is a whole different thing. And like she said, different genres and subgenres have different expectations. You can potentially sell something that's like 12,000 words as a novella, but it's going to depend on the market. Some short story markets will take things up to 10,000 words. That's going to be really, really long for a lot of them. If you can consistently tell a good story at about 3,500 words to 4,000 words, like you were told, that is a really, really good length for the vast majority of markets, unless they're doing something very specialized.
And if you're trying to sell a short story, shorter is better, especially if you're an unknown,
Yeah.
because they can slide in another 2,000 word short story, but if you send them something that's 6,000 words and they don't know who you are and they don't have room in the anthology, they're not going to boot somebody else out to fit in your giant monstrosity of a story. So if you can keep them short, especially when you're first starting out, that's really helpful.
We have time for one more. Lauren, did you have a question? Or did you want to defer? All right, you go ahead. She's with us, so she can ask us anytime. Oh,
Interesting.
well, I'm going to defer on this one. I mean,
I feel like Lucy's the expert.
yeah,
here,
Lucy,
it's not.
take it away, Lucy, no pressure.
All right. Yeah, I mean, Poe is definitely an influence on a lot of us. It's not, he's not an influence on everybody. I mean, there's some people who are coming up as writers who haven't read a lot of classic literature, but most everybody they've read have read it. So it's sort of like, when you were talking about the Donald Moss book being a recommendation, even though you haven't read it personally,
Right.
it's sort of like people get influenced, and so people are reading influences of Poe all the time and maybe don't realize it, but yeah, his influence is all over the horror genre still, even if it's not super obvious. And in terms of like, the second question was how does modern horror compare to what was coming out in like The 70s, is that? Yeah, oh, for sure, yeah, they definitely did. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are some people who are looking back on that time as like, you know, kind of a retro time, because especially since there's been a lot of horror movies out that have, you know, taken place in the 70s and 80s. You know, like we've got Stranger Things in the 80s, like movies like X that take place in the 70s. So, you know, there's kind of some retro nostalgia happening there. So there are some people who are deliberately writing in the style of people who wrote back then. And then some people, it's simply that's what they read when they were coming up. And so those were some very early horror influences for them. In terms of like the differences, I would say that like there's a different sensibility now. Like there's a lot of stuff that was written back then that we would look at it now and go, oh boy, this is super problematic for one reason or another. And people just have there's stuff that was published back then that like wouldn't be now because of content. But you know, that's going to vary.
I just want to throw out a mention of Paperbacks from Hell by Grady Hendrix. Have you read this book? The library has it, and it is fantastic. He looks at all of these paperbacks from the 70s and 80s, and how like most of them are really bad. They're like, because that was like the heyday of horror paperbacks, where people would just buy them, and you could make a living being basically a hack and like writing books inspired by The Exorcist, because everyone, when The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby came out, then it was like everyone just wanted the next Exorcist or Rosemary's Baby. So there were people who were just churning out these terrible novels under pen names that made zero sense, but there was like, you know, a cradle on the cover. So if you liked Rosemary's Baby, you should buy this one, right? And
it totally worked. People were buying
and
horror
Paperbacks from Hell is hilarious.
like crazy back then.
And I do think there's a thing, especially if you're on cocaine, called stereotypy, where you think that your words are the best words, and so you will like overwrite, and your prose becomes extremely purple. And I do think, you know, that a lot of the books produced in that time were written under the influence, and you can kind of tell because of the, you know, partly because they don't make any sense, but also because the way that they're written, they just repeat themselves over and over again. And yeah, so there is definitely a different sensibility now. I kind of wish that those days would come back, those days of the horror paperbacks just flying off the shelves, because then we could all make a living writing horror.
Anyone else?
I have a passion for vintage paperbacks. Like, it was really good, like really thin, like 150 page, like gothic horror. A thing I noticed in those, like just talking about like the kind of like what's in style now versus then is basically now in writing, like it's dialogue text. Like you say something like during the panel Rob said this and Megan said this. Back in the day, like the idea was to have like this vast array of dialogue tags. So he sputtered this, he said this, my favorite one is he ejaculated this.
Oh yeah, and that one was in The Nest. I read that one in The Nest, and I underlined it because I was like, really?
Yeah, like, even when my daughter was learning to write in school, like they told her that, like they told her like mix up your dialogue, don't just keep saying say, like, but that's not good writing advice. now we just say or ask. That's it, basically. Unless there's a reason, you know. Sometimes, occasionally, you might whisper some dialogue, perhaps an utterance, but typically, yeah, that's not something that would be done nowadays.
All right, we are out of time. We need to reset. We will be back in a few minutes with the Monster Mash collaborative monster storytelling. But in the meantime, I think we have a couple of giveaways. Thank you guys for coming out and seeing us.
If you ask a question and you would like to first come, first serve, these are pumpkin napkins. And this, you can put your olive oil in when you're cooking. And also I have a notebook that says, write for the ones who like what you write, not the ones who don't.
And I also have some just trick or treat, like it's trick or treat every day when you're in the Horror Writers Association. So there's some candy and skeleton bookmarks and stickers in there. So if you would ask a question and would like some, come on up. But thank you all so much for being on the panel. You all were amazing. And thank you all for coming.